Okay, good evening. I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Keisha Rogers, and before we start tonight's discussion, I want to make an announcement for our listeners on this call and also listeners on our social media. And the announcement is that LaRouche PAC is changing its name. This is the first. We have a new website that will be going into action. Our name is going to be called Promethean Action. And this will be launched within the course of the next 3 months. Let me just say, it will start to carry selections and content shortly, and is actively recruiting members based on its mission statement, which you can find on the Promethean Action website. So the Promethean Action website, which is going to be unfolded over the course of a 3-month period and will continue, as I said, to put new material on there, is prometheanaction.com. And there's a lot more explanation and development of what our new name, what the mission is going to be centered around. And we can take up questions on this a little bit later on. I will just make the point that as I said, for the next 3 months, you can still go to the LaRouche PAC for content, but by April, the LaRouche PAC name will be changed to Promethean Action, and the LaRouche PAC content will be totally absorbed into the Promethean Action site and related social media accounts. As you probably already know, but I'll spell this out to people anyway. Neither LaRouche PAC, Promethean Action, LaRouche PAC, Promethean Action, or Promethean PAC are affiliated or associated with Helga Zepp LaRouche, EIR, or Schiller Institute, the LaRouche Organization, LaRouche Legacy, or any other entity associated with Helga LaRouche. And you can find more details of this on our LaRouche PAC page for now, as I said, which will be transitioning over to the new Promethean Action. So that's to start our discussion for tonight, but I think it goes straight to our theme from the standpoint of everything that we have represented is defined by the moment in history we find ourselves, from the standpoint that the fight is to save the United States of America. The fight that we are embarking on is to define the Promethean in all of you. And tonight's discussion is going to be around the idea of the Kairos moment. And we're going to let Michael take that up a little bit more in terms of the principle of what we're seeing unfold in the attacks against the United States, attacks against our republic. And that is really on two fronts we're going to be discussing this on today. The two fronts we want to take up from this critical moment in history is from the standpoint of what we're facing on the war front. And I'll just start off the discussion by announcing what everybody already knows, that we're continuing to see a total escalation toward the threat of war. And we're not only seeing an escalation, we're finding ourselves directly in the middle of a threat of war that is being led by the Biden administration and those rhinos who want to continue to push the United States to the brink of thermonuclear war. But in that context, as people know, we have just witnessed the drone strikes on the Jordanian border. that resulted in the killing of 3 troops, which were killed in a hostile fire attack by Iranian-backed militants. As a result of this, you have had the response coming from Joe Biden as saying that he will respond and he will respond with appropriate actions. He vows retaliation after the drone strike, is what he has stated, and the retaliation that people like Lindsey Graham and Nikki Haley, former Ambassador Nikki Haley, along with others, is that the only retaliation that is sufficient is to call for bombing Iran right away and to have direct targeted strikes. As a matter of fact, Nikki Haley came out recently in a tweet saying that we should retaliate with full force of American strength. The only way to prevent further war, it's the only way to prevent further war. And so this is completely insane, and it is absolutely what President Trump has stood firmly against, the continuation of these endless wars and call for stopping the funding of these wars, and not only stopping the funding, but showing that he's the only one that can actually address a peaceful solution to this. But I think we'll discuss this a little bit more, because I'm going to bring in a little later on Tony Pappert, who gave the discussion last week on the threat of what is continuing to unfold in Israel and Gaza, as well as now this new escalation and development. On top of it, you have also many questions that need to be asked about the military readiness of our country to even go into war. The question that should be asked are we going to war with Iran? Are we already in a war with Iran? And what are the consequences of this, which we will take up in our discussion? This was something that was actually asked earlier on Tucker Carlson in an interview that he just did. And we should also address the question of what is the question of military readiness and putting our troops forth as sitting ducks in these areas. So we'll take those up. The final thing that I want to bring up in terms of what we're going to take up in discussion, and that I want Michael and later we will have Tony Pappert on to comment, is the question of the border conflict, which is absolutely out of control. As people know, there was just a bill that was introduced. There has been continued back and forth and conflict in the US Congress and the Senate on the question of the funding of the Ukraine and funding of Israel in these war fronts, and that the reality is there is no deal that has been met with the insane policies being put forth by the Rhino Republicans, calling in the Senate that have called for an agreement to be put forth that to have 5,000 people a day be able to come across the southern border. And we can go into the consequences of what this would mean. And the idea would be that once we reached 5,000 illegals, invaders coming across the southern border, then the president, Joe Biden, has the authority to shut down the border. We know that this is not going to work. They have no control over this border. It's completely open. And we're going to discuss, what does this mean? What are the Democrats and others in the Rhino operation trying to accomplish from the standpoint of creating a situation where we fully open our borders, where we allow for criminals to come in and continue to come in droves to destroy our economy further, to bring terrorists into the country. And this is what we're facing right now, and what we have to respond to immediately as we prepare to for an all-out fight to save the country. And more people are recognizing that as we witness what transformation is taking place in the American population with the recent victories of President Donald Trump in New Hampshire, in Iowa, as has been discussed, and that recruitment to this movement that Trump has created is continuing to grow fiercely, grow in a very important way. So it's time for people to take action now, and we're going to bring in Michael for his thoughts and comments on what I've just developed here, what's happening, and also we'll have some further discussion later.
Great, thanks, Keisha. Thanks for the overview. So I'll keep my comments, kind of try to situate some of these events, maybe how to think about them, or how we, and then open it up for dialogue and discussion. Certainly, Tony Pappert presented last week the increasing tension around the war, and the point, the thesis of his statements, as it came out in the discussion with emphasis, was the intention of these wars is ultimately to suck the United States into and to ultimately destroy the United States, to bring it into an expanded war, to undermine its credibility, undermine its capacity, and create the kind of chaos and destruction that then is opened up on the domestic front. I mean, our divisions as a nation stem largely from the Vietnam War conflict, and what that opened up in terms of the counterculture revolution, which is largely the basis for the fascist takeover in our country today. I mean, the Biden regime is a direct result of that revolution. So we intend to create our own. We intend to renew. I mean, it's now been 50 years since that division. And Tony will address some of the specifics of the war, or some of just his follow-up insights to that. But as Keisha mentioned, American troops have been killed. It's not clear whether it was in Jordan or whether it was in Syria. Many people are asking, why wasn't there an air defense system that could have shot down the drone? These are all legitimate questions. But as Keisha mentioned, Joe Kent, who is a Army veteran and congressional candidate up in Washington State, I think made the most important point. We have between 30 and 50,000 troops in this entire West Asian region. And many of those troops are deployed on small bases of 3,000 to 5,000 troops in places like Iraq, Syria, Jordan, as well as then down more towards the Persian Gulf and in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. But these troops are just sitting ducks. There is no capacity to really protect them or defend them. And the whole point of this kind of escalation, now Iran has said very clearly they were not responsible. Now, it doesn't mean they're not backing the militias, but they didn't order it. And other assessments, people like Colonel McGregor have been clear, there is great Arabic unity. The Arab community, the Arab nations, the Arab populations are in strong solidarity with the Palestinians. And that what Israel is right now engaged in is ultimately the destruction of Israel, what Netanyahu's regime is participating in. Now, maybe Israel has a pathway out, but it's drawing the United States into this dynamic. And these troop deployments are sitting there, deployed by the military industrial complex, by the neocons, by the war hawks, by the Uniparty in Washington to drag us to be injured, to be pawns, to be targeted, to be destroyed, to be killed. That then is the bloody shirt that compels the American people in some kind of knee-jerk response into a broader conflict. And if this conflict continues, it will become a world war. Now, this area of the world is targeted because it is the crossroads of Asia, Europe, and Africa. So it's an old, hotbed for conflict. Mr. LaRouche made this assessment often. And so it's been specifically targeted to, at the same time, if a war breaks out, to wreak havoc on the entire global economy. As we've seen with the Ukraine war, one of the most important consequences of this was a threatened collapse of global energy. They attempted to sanction and prevent Russia from even selling its energy on the global market or at a major loss. That didn't happen. Nations like India, as well as China, became huge purchasers of Russia, and Russia is now opening up the Northern Sea route in the Arctic for oil and other logistical transports outside the control of the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So Russia's strength has massively improved, but what has not improved since the beginning of this war has been the economic potential of mankind on this planet. The destruction of Germany's industrial capability, the skyrocketing costs of fuel. They're now attempting to tax German farmers on fuel costs. This has been a tax break they got for 70 years. They now want to increase that. So you have massive protests in Germany, but in France, as was mentioned last week, and this just continues, they're literally spraying cow excrement all over the streets of Paris, inside certain grocery stores, on government buildings, on sidewalks. I mean, the farmers are lit. They are lit. There is a total revolt because there is no legitimate political representation. In Germany, there's an attempt to not address the food production, to not address the energy production that was lost with Nord Stream and for other just insane reasons, the shutdown of nuclear power. They're literally attempting to ban the only political party, the Alternative for Deutschland or Alternative for Germany, attempting to ban it, which has a difficult limit. You have to reach a very high threshold to ban a party in Germany, but you can ban one, unlike here. And they're attempting to ban that and they're covering more the danger of that political party than they are the farmers' protests. And at the same time as the farmers are protesting increased taxes, the German government is attempting to send more money to Ukraine. And the German Green Party, which came into existence as a pro-peace party during the Cold War, regarding the danger of nuclear war, is now calling for Germany to deploy its own nuclear weapons. So people are going mad. And you could say, well, this is the intention of it. I'm not sure it's the intention to go mad. I'm not sure it's the intention to create global destruction. You could say it's clearly the underlying intention because that's the outcome of their policies. The bigger problem is that the axioms and outlook of these people, of this globalist cabal, of this kind of neoliberal regime, they are incapable of maintaining control and continuing to act upon the same worldview, the same axioms of decision-making. They continue to make those decisions. They continue to use things like Putin as the new Hitler. That's the greatest danger to Europe, not the collapse of food supply, not the collapse of energy, not the collapse of industry, not the skyrocketing inflation prices, not the floods because of a lack of river control, or the danger of a world war breaking out in the Middle East because of the United States' deployments. There's no criticism coming from allies. There used to be in 2003, there were real criticisms of the United States. The Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schroeder, did not support the Iraq war. And there was outspoken disagreements on certain policies, especially on the war questions. But we're not in 2003 any longer. These nations of Europe have now been under the boot of basically a rising fascism in Europe, basically the EU, European Union. The Middle East is not, you could not do a cakewalk. In 2003, when we invaded Iraq, you could not. We basically bribed the military, easy to do, bribe them. They basically let us march into Baghdad. You can look at Marine Corps companies of the Marines, soldiers of the Marines, tell you there was almost no conflict. We didn't get into real major conflicts until we set up an occupation of the country. And of course, then we kept out all of the leadership, all of the military officers from having any role in the country. So they formed ISIS. And then we had to deal with that, of course. So you could not do a cakewalk into Baghdad today. And even more so, and this is something Colonel McGregor has pointed out, Iran is armed to the teeth. They did 3 major launches last week, 2 in Syria targeting a Mossad base, another location, I think, in Syria, and then a location in Pakistan. And each of them were of precision strikes. One was near the US embassy and didn't come close to even doing, it did 0 damage to any US property. So the idea that somehow the United States will somehow be able to enter this conflict unscathed, that Joe Biden can just simply retaliate to Iran. Many people forecast that he won't attack Iran territory directly. He'll attack proxy groups of Iran. But you're looking at an increasing, day by day, week by week escalation, and an escalation of conflict for Israel, which is a relatively small nation with a small population in this region compared to Turkey, Iran, and Egypt. 3 nations who, as civilization, go back to at least the 1500 BC, so 3,500, 4,000 years of continued existence as civilizations and population centers. So, with large armies, advanced technological capabilities, GPS precision targeting, and the center of much of the fuel supply for much of the world, especially in Asia. So this is kind of where the world develops as we enter into the domestic picture of the United States. And Biden has, as Keisha just said, is willing to say, close the border. If one, we offer a pathway of citizenship to upwards of 30 million people, all of which will be giving, probably 3 mail-in ballots to send in for the election. It's a massive electioneering attempt. It's blatant. You're just considered racist if you say that, but it's blatant. Lyndon LaRouche said the same thing in 1976 about how the Democrats were taking the vote in California. It's been ongoing for 50 years of an election engineering and power stealing process in this country. And if you give them 30 million, up to 30 million people citizenship, and we allow 5,000 people a day into the country with work permits to completely undercut. If you look at employment numbers, we're only employing foreign-born citizens or foreign-born people in this country. That could be up the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. That the numbers of jobs created for Americans, I mean, obviously the baby boomers are retiring and so on, but this is getting a bit absurd because we're just creating very low skill jobs. There's no real economic growth. There's no real industry and so on in the country. I mean, clearly Boeing can't produce a plane. General Motors and Ford and the big automotive companies, not only are they offshoring all the manufacturing jobs to Mexico and elsewhere, they've offshored the engineering jobs out of the United States. This is the dynamic that's taking place, and it's dramatic. So you have this conflict with Texas. There's this huge convoy going down to the border. as everyone can tell, this has a dangerous characteristic to it. Many people are pointing out what happened in J6 and the false flags. But you can see the dramatic tension that is developing rapidly. And it's not just in the United States domestic perspective. Because of Trump's leading voice here, because of what he was able to run such a proficient campaign in Iowa and New Hampshire, he'll take Nevada next week. He will take South Carolina later this month. He has consolidated clear leadership. He is the operating candidate for president of the Republican Party. He is essentially operating as an acting president, and he has shut down this insane border deal, which, even more bizarre than anything, is that the Senate wanted to pass this and say, this is the border package that you demanded so that we could pass $60 billion for Ukraine. And of course, the argument for $60 billion in Ukraine is the only manufacturing we have left in this country is defense sector. And so a lot of that money will go to creating manufacturing jobs. You have to wonder to yourself how much crack these people are smoking. The level of tension can lead one to pull their hair out or to almost feel I see people posting questions, and we'll get to those in the answers. We appreciate it. Feel free to post questions during this period. We look forward to the discussion. Moments like this take place, and if you're participating in it, you don't have to follow all the details of a process. There's a mistaken sense of how we can act effectively. And we all get sometimes overwhelmed by the news of a process, especially when it's so intense as today. You tend to turn it off, which is not necessarily a bad thing to do. Over this weekend, I was reflecting on the overall situation, and I thought to myself, man, I really missed Lyndon LaRouche. Now, it will be about 5 years since Lyndon passed. I think it was February 12th of 2019. It was Lincoln's birthday. So it'll be 5 years this February. And he was obviously less active in his last years. But a core concept in Lyndon LaRouche's method of economic forecasting was not, as one person asked him at one time, how do you make a forecast, Lyndon? He was renowned for forecasts. He made a famous forecast of the 1957 recession, which was the first major downturn since the World War II. And it really scared a lot of people. It wasn't a big downturn compared to how much of a collapsed country we are today. But you can imagine for people that as in their youth went through the Great Depression, such a crisis was somewhat, but no one foresaw it. Lynn was on record as a New York consultant at the time. He also forecast the 1971 Bretton Woods collapse, which made him an internationally recognized economist and policy figure. And he was asked, that's just some background for those who may not know. He was asked one time by a younger associate, how do you make a forecast, Lynn? Do you just look at all this data and all these charts and all this information, just go through it, pour and pour and pour all this material and really just devour everything? He was like, no, not at all. I don't do that. He said, what he said is maybe hard to recollect directly, but the nature of it was that one of his underlying concepts was that you clearly can see you're reaching definitive points, points of inflection, that the rate of escalation, the rate of tension, the rate of insanity can't continue. I mean, the Biden regime is literally threatening Texas and other states in the country, but including Texas, because it's a major natural gas exporter, of exporting natural gas. Well, what do you think Europe is dependent upon for energy once we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. It's our liquid natural gas exported largely out of places like Texas. So this kind of inability to ever have an adequate or effective response that solves a problem, where everything done either by intention or by just malicious stupidity only aggravates a problem, you're looking at a kind of an inflection point. And that's what was provocative, that there is these different conceptions of time. And to me, I don't know how anyone can survive living in this strategic world and participating as a global citizen, as an active citizen for mankind and for our nation today in this political war, without a sense that the way that time is presented, this practical notion of time, and you have to realize, you talk to a modern physicist today and they would say, I don't even know if time existed. I mean, the scientists have completely lost all perspective. The so-called smartest people in the room are now people in a padded room, or should be. But the question of time that's practical, that's day by day, inch by inch, second by second, through the seasons, and it just slowly progresses, accumulates, and it's just this duration of a single line, points on a line that you're just slowly ticking by, is childish at best. That's maybe how even I would even be hard pressed to say that's how an animal sees time, but it probably is. It probably is an effective way of maybe describing how an animal experiences time. But for a human person and for human society to reduce time merely to, the calendar cycles, even in that sense, is greatly mistaken. It is shaped by, as a fabric, as a part of the physical universe, that we approach certain critical moments. That happens within the course of human society. It's the very nature of human society to not just be a regular, just cyclical clock, going around and around in its various cycles, tick by tick, but that we see potential growth, or we see collapse. We see the potential birth of a new child, of a new generation. We see the potential launching of the largest rocket to the moon and to Mars. We see the breakthroughs of new discoveries, the buildings of new cities, or the buying of a new home for a family. But or the harvest period for a farmer. And the Greeks had that sense, as did the early Christians in writing the New Testament. This notion of Kairos as the concept of time, that chronos is the kind of duration of time that just kind of tick by tick continues, almost biologically or geological time. Probably still misconceptions, but nonetheless, for our experience, maybe that works. The rate of erosion of a sand clock or something. But that we reach certain critical moments where action can be made that can fundamentally change an entire dynamic. And we're participating in that. And there's not necessarily a lot any of us, maybe some of us, each of us can do different things. Some can do more, some maybe can do less, given time, standing, capacity, and so on. But everyone can be aware. Everyone with an active human mind can be cognizant that we are rapidly approaching decisive decisions, decisive events in terms of the economic situation of our country, the financial circumstances, the conditions of productive areas of the economy like farmers or industry or energy supply, of global shipping, as well as the overall threat of war. And why Trump and this MAGA movement have become such a critical role is not because they're sufficient as it is now, but this becomes a medium to raise the level to an even higher standard. And at such moments, like what Lincoln confronted with the rebellion from South Carolina and the southern states, or what Franklin Roosevelt experienced with the collapse of the banking system. That these kinds of questions, these kinds of events, which have accumulated over even decades to create a real crisis point, if there is an awakened population, not awoke, but an awakened people, prepared to act, prepared to organize with a vision of where to go, to resolve the crisis, not by choosing one of two bad options, but by ultimately creating a third one, then we can solve this. That's ultimately how our nation has continued to exist, and how human civilization continues to thrive. These ideas, this conception of a universe, is outside the scope of our enemy. And if we live in this kind of universe, it is our single greatest threat and power to overcome their insanity. And so amidst all of this intensity, I think these kinds of ideas and conceptions, and to make conscious, deliberate, and disciplined decisions to live. Which universe are you going to live in today? Not what side of the bed did you get up on, but what universe are you going to live in? How are you going to participate in this universe? And to make that more of a conscious culture of what it means to be human and what it means to be an American is more decisive today than it has ever been in any of our lives. Because this crisis, well, I attempted, and Keisha and I both presented various elements to, is incredibly dramatic, more intense than anything we've seen in the last 20 years. So anyways, those are my thoughts for tonight. Hopefully people found those useful. I think Keisha said we're going to bring in Tony Papert for some discussion on the war briefly. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions as well. So Keisha, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, very good. I'm just going to bring Tony Papert right in, and then so he can follow up.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey, Tony.
How you doing? Yeah, thanks for bringing me in. Mike said, Mike covered the situation pretty fully, but at least since February 22, when the Ukraine war began, President Trump has said, I can guarantee you as president, I will prevent World War III. He says, everybody knows, I think he said it repeatedly, and coupled it with a statement that we've never been closer to World War III. And, he was initially speaking after this insane proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, triggered by Biden, which has been going on since, with disastrous results for the world, for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the United States, even though we're an ocean away. But, and that situation has moved closer to World War III, as we've seen. But now, since October 7th of last year, with the Hamas raid into Israel, we're going into a slipping and sliding into toward a massive regional war in the Mideast, which could even go beyond the Mideast. And as far as its interactions with the still ongoing bloody struggle in Ukraine, that I'm not sure what they could be, but certainly there could be interactions with that. Now, about 2 weeks ago, Biden with Britain, and Britain is always there to help us get involved in these wars. Biden with the British government of Sunak began almost daily bombing and rocket raids against the Houthis in Yemen, because the Houthis were effectively blockading the Red Sea to certain ships connected with Israel, U.S., Britain. I mean, that was an insane move. As I said, I'm sure a week ago, I mean, the Houthis had survived an 8-year intensive air campaign by Saudi Arabia from around 2015 through 2022, where all the planes, all the munitions, all the intelligence came from the US. So it was basically an intense US air campaign, more intense than the one that's being done now, for 8 years. And it was really US intelligence, US everything. After the 8 years, the Saudis decided they were not winning. They had to negotiate. And that's what they've been doing. I mean, the war is now in negotiation, although that may break down in current circumstances. So there's no hope of accomplishing anything with those bombing raids in Yemen. And if you look at the raids, what's shown I'm not going to go into the details here, but what's shown is the lack of US rockets and other US munitions because they've all been sent over to Ukraine. So it's an insane proceeding. I mean, Biden should have sat down and talked with the Houthis. And, I have some idea what they would have said to him. I'll go into that. Now, but those raids are continuing. Meanwhile, since October 7th and since the Israeli really savage attack, I mean, of course, the October 7th raid was savage and brutal, but the Israeli, all these months, more than 3 months of bombing of housing, hospitals, and everything else in Gaza, killing 26,000 Gazans, 10,000 children. The effect of that has been that militias across the Mideast, and people say, well, they're militias allied with Iran, and they are allied. They're in this loose thing called Axis of Resistance, and they have varying relations with Iran. But they have been bombarding the defenseless US bases in the Middle East, which Mike referred to, small bases which have no way to defend themselves and no purpose in being there. So they've waged probably 200 attacks by now on these scattered US bases since October 7th. And then yesterday, what had to happen, I think, eventually did happen. 3 US troops were tragically killed in one of those raids. So there's a question of how the Biden administration is going to react. Biden would, for all his faults as a president and a human being, which are considerable, he would desperately like to avoid a major war in the Middle East for various reasons, which you can imagine. He would desperately like to avoid war with Iran, which I'll discuss in a minute. But the question is, given the incompetence of his administration, his own, mental state, which seems to be borderline in many cases, and his weakness as a president, he's not going to say, I'm declaring war on Iran tomorrow, but will he blunder into that war with Iran, which is the last thing or one of the last things he'd like to happen? Unfortunately, it's very likely. Now, of course, he's being encouraged toward a war with Iran by Nikki Haley and Lindsey Graham and many others. The Lindsey Graham is a bachelor senator who is always finding foreign countries to send the children of other Americans to die. Now, let me clarify. So this is a situation, it's a very dangerous situation. President Trump is not demanding any form of military action against Iran or anybody. He posted a 3-part tweet on this yesterday, and very clear. He said, peace through strength. Biden's weakness has brought this about. I will I will keep us out of World War III. He did not and would not in this situation, as was he when he was president. He took care to avoid a war with Iran. This was just, I mean, I just had an exchange, one-way exchange so far with David Sanger of the New York Times, who has an analysis piece, Dateline Today, which quotes Dan Crenshaw, the congressman known as Eye Patch McCain, saying we should kill another Iranian general. And then Sanger goes on to say, President Trump is even more vocal, but this is implying he wants to do even more than Crenshaw. The opposite is the case. It's a lie. I wrote to Sanger about this just a few minutes ago. I mean, war with Iran would be hell, as Mike alluded to. I mean, this is a forbidding mountainous country of 80 million population. They are extremely warlike people. And the Iran of today is very well armed with modern missiles and drones. I mean, as people probably know, I mean, the Russians picked up an Iranian drone, manufactured themselves, and are using that in Ukraine on a large scale. And then Mike cited the recent Iranian pinpoint accuracy in missile attacks in 3 locations in other countries several days ago, maybe a week ago. So this is a very well-armed country and a militant country, and a war with Iran would not only be a war with Iran. Now, I mean, I should ask him, I should find a way to ask him about this, which I haven't, but Colonel McGregor, whom Mike mentioned, who's a illustrious retired U.S. Army colonel, who's a frequent commentator and a very well-informed one on these topics, has said on his interviews that Russia and China would not stand by if the U.S. attacked Iran. He's never explained what he meant by that. And so, I mean, if he means that Russia and China will enter a war against the U.S. With Iran, if such a war arises, I strongly doubt that. I'd like to hear why he thinks that's the case. I don't think that's true. But a war with Iran will not only be a war with Iran, because in the current situation of the Gaza bloodshed and killing, which is on 2 billion cell phones. I mean, there are 2 billion Muslims in the world. It's 1/4 of the world's population. And maybe not all 2 billion have cell phones, but certainly most of them do. And what is on those cell phones is day after day of killing in Gaza. That's what they're watching. And so a U.S. war with Iran would be immediately, as soon as it opened, it would be much broader than a war with Iran, and it would be hell. I mean, Mike cited Vietnam. Iran and Vietnam have similar population, actually. And, there's geographical difficulties in both countries. But the United States that went to war in Vietnam, for all the fact that we ultimately lost the war, was a far stronger United States than, unfortunately, what we have today. So a war with Iran will be hell. It's nothing you want to see. I mean, certainly if our country is attacked, we have to defend it. But a war with Iran must be avoided at all costs. Now, or at almost all costs. Now, there's only one way around this danger, which I've probably made completely clear. On the day that there's a ceasefire in Gaza, the danger of war with Iran ends. And the danger of spread of the war from Yemen ends. And the danger of the war on Israel's northern border with Hezbollah in Lebanon ends. the day of that ceasefire, the danger ends of all those things. And even the fact that 3 of our soldiers have been killed, we can find a way to make amends or make an answer for that. Which is not, I mean, as Iran said, they have a kind of loose alliance of groups, but the military actions taken, for instance, by the Houthis in Yemen are not dictated by Iran, and they can't be stopped by Iran. I mean, the Houthis say they're going to stop, as I said, when the people stop being killed in Gaza. I mean, we're in a situation, as I've written in an article a week or two ago, but it's more true even now. We're in a situation where Israel's military action, or more specifically, Netanyahu's military action, because he's the prime minister, and he has his own interests in addition to the interests of Israel, because the day this war ends, the wartime government, which was formed to fight this war in Israel, ends. Netanyahu is probably almost immediately or immediately removed from office and goes on trial for corruption. So Netanyahu has motives to keep this war going, which many in Israel, many even in his own government, want to put an end to. So the obvious, so, well, let me go, one place I was going and then finish up. I mean, Israel cannot sustain, according to US intelligence, this was featured in our press some weeks ago. According to US intelligence, Israel cannot prevail if they are forced to fight in Gaza as they are now, in the West Bank as they are now, and on the northern border to Lebanon, as they are not, but they could be at any time, either by Israeli action to spread the war to the north or by Hezbollah. Although Hezbollah has said they're not going to do that at present. Our intelligence has said Israel could not survive that 3-front war, still less a war in which Iran entered. So the time has come for an American president to curtail Israel military action in Gaza in the interests, among other things, of Israel's survival. Because Israel could not survive the war which is shaping up against them in the Mideast, even with US help. So strong American presidents have done this in the past. Again, as I wrote, in 1956, Eisenhower, in 1973, Nixon. They prevailed on Israeli governments to suspend their military action in the interests of the existence of Israel. And they were able to do so just as Biden is, because every bomb dropped, every shell fired is American in the war right now. So the answer is, a ceasefire in Gaza with the return of all hostages and release of a lot of Palestinian prisoners of Israel. That's the answer. Biden knows that, and he's trying to achieve that. But he's a weak president. He's ineffective. There's a lot of details about how he's trying to bring that about. Probably readers know it. I mean, some of the details differ depending on who you listen to. But there is a Biden effort with the CIA director and others to patch together such a ceasefire. The biggest obstacle is Netanyahu, who blew it up about a week ago, could certainly do it again. Will Biden have the strength, and will Biden have the kishkas to do that? All the American and worldwide demonstrations for ceasefire in Gaza, all the American Muslims and others, and most recently black pastors, I think maybe 100 or more black pastors calling on Biden for a ceasefire, as election approaches. I think this is all very helpful. Congress has got to stand up right now and say, you're contemplating military action in the Middle East. Congress has got to be involved under the law. You don't have the authority to do this on your own under the War Powers Act. Congress has got to be consulted. So, in my opinion, that's more or less the situation we're at. It's great danger for our country and for the world. And I look forward to any questions or discussion on that.
Thank you, Tony. That was excellent.